Hello Europa Universalis players, my name's Riemann, and today I want to talk to you about institutions. This has been one of the single biggest changes to the game in years, because it completely upends the method and rate at which nations get technologies. In this video, I'll talk about institutions in several ways. I'll go over strategies for how you can best utilize some of the intricacies of this new system. I'll cover everything from the basics of how you slow your enemy neighbors from getting your institutions, to advanced timings for when you should think about conquering different parts of the world to take advantage of the maximum technological disparity. Next, I'll show you several time lapses of institution spread, and I'll point out some small but important changes over the course of the game that lead to recurring patterns of institutional growth in various parts of the world. Finally, I'll give an examination for what institutions mean in terms of balancing and what they mean for EU4 going forward. So here's my in-depth analysis on institutions in Europa Universalis 4. So first, let's quickly go over the basics. Institutions have replaced the old tech groups for determining how many monarch points you have to spend to get technologies. They appear in provinces based on a few conditions about every 50 years, with the first one, Renaissance, usually appearing in 1450, and the last one, Enlightenment, appearing in 1700. For each year a nation hasn't embraced an institution, technologies get 1% more expensive, up to a maximum increase of 50% after 50 years for any one institution. To embrace an institution, it must be present in 10% of a nation's autonomy-modified development. This allows a country to pay 2.5 ducats per autonomy-modified development that does not have the institution to embrace it and remove the tech penalty. For example, you can see here my nation has 3 provinces, each with exactly 20 development, and the Renaissance is present in one of them. So the development of the 2 provinces that don't have the Renaissance is multiplied by 2.5 to give a total cost of 100 ducats. If I increase the autonomy in one of my provinces, it drops the price down to 87.5. This cost means you could theoretically face a strategic trade-off between spending a lot of cash to get an institution early, or waiting for it to spread to a few more of your provinces to drop the price. In reality though, it's often worth embracing institutions as soon as you plan on getting new technologies. Money is plentiful in EU4 while monarch points are precious, meaning it might be worth taking out a few loans if you're short on cash. The small fee you'll pay on interest can easily be worth the points you'll save. Now let's talk about institution spread. By far the most prevalent form of spreading is simply from province to province. If an institution is in one province, it will slowly leak to nearby provinces with the speed determined by a few factors. The first factor is if the province with the institution is friendly or not. Friendly provinces are those in the same country, and those in different countries where relations are greater than 0. They spread much faster and can spread up to 1 sea zone away compared to non-friendly provinces which spread slower and only spread through a land connection. The next major factor is the development of the province receiving the institution. The higher the development, the quicker the spread. This means institutions can spread like wildfire in France, Germany, Italy, and China, but seem to slow to a snail's pace in places like Central Asia and even parts of Eastern Europe. Besides spreading from province to province, institutions have other methods they can become present. The main ones are that colonialism generates if you have a colonial nation, the printing press generates if you have diplotech higher than 15, international trade develops from centers of trade, and manufactories and the Enlightenment both come from buildings. So how does this typically break down in-game? If you're in or near Europe, you don't have to worry much. Institutions will usually spread fast enough that you don't need to take many special precautions to get them. On the other hand, if you're not near Europe, you'll have issues with the first 3 institutions that spawn, the Renaissance, colonialism, and the printing press. Global trade is easy for everyone to get, and manufactories in the Enlightenment can easily be attained by constructing buildings. The first 3, though, are the problem. Non-Europeans can do a few things to get them. The first is to just wait for natural spread. This might sound odious, but it's actually not that bad if you're not aiming to conquer the world. Since institutions spread from province to province, you'll never be far behind your neighbors in tech cost. If everybody's paying extra, then nobody is paying extra, at least relative to the nations that matter to them, i.e. their neighbors. This is a perfectly legitimate way to play if you're not minimaxing things, even if it might not feel the greatest. The second way to get institutions is to buddy up to Europeans whenever they drop by. Some good places to get near to are the Ottomans, Australia, Goa, South Africa, and the uncolonized parts of Indonesia. Simply get a few provinces near one of these areas through colonization or conquest, raise relations above 0, and wait for the spread. Finally, the third way to get institutions is to develop them yourself, either by fulfilling their specific requirements or by developing your provinces. Paradox never advertised this a lot, but if you have the Common Sense expansion, you can develop your provinces, and each time you do, you'll get a bit closer to having the oldest non-embraced institution in that province. This is the quickest and most straightforward way for non-Europeans to get institutions themselves, and thus it deserves some additional explanation. The exact equation is that for every development in a province, the province gets 1/6 of its new development value added in percentiles to the institution progress. For example, the capital of Korea here is 16.49% of the way to getting the Renaissance. If I develop it once more, its development becomes 20, meaning it gets 20 divided by 6, which equals 3.33% added to its progress towards the Renaissance. You should only have to develop one province, and then you can wait for it to spread far enough to embrace the institution on your terms. Choosing which province to develop it in is very important. You want to stack development cost reductions as much as you can, such as making the burgher estates happy, choosing a farmlands province, and having that province be your capital. Beyond this, you should also factor in the starting development of the province. Development has a bigger institution impact to already highly developed provinces, but the cost of developing spirals upward for each development as well. This means there's a mathematical sweet spot for the ideal starting development to minimize your costs. To explore this, I created a program that ran several simulations of different starting development and development cost reductions. Here are the results. The good thing about developing for institutions is that minor changes can make you much more efficient. The bad thing is that there are peaks and valleys all over the place, so it's hard to develop a quick and easy rule of thumb. You can see here that if you have no net changes in development cost, the sweet spot for starting development is 16. But starting with 17 is inferior to starting with 18, while starting with 15 or 14 is inferior to 13. This esoteric jumping around means it's not worth it to truly understand the math here unless you want extreme efficiency. Because of this, I won't bother going over these charts in great detail. Instead, I'll point out a few interesting facts. The first is that having a starting development of 7 saves you exactly 200 monarch points compared to starting with 3, so there's definitely a reason not to just look for your poorest province when doing this. If we take a look at changing the development cost modifiers, another pattern emerges. If the dev cost increases, it flattens the right part of the graph, so that 24 becomes the optimal starting point. But if you can get the dev cost to decrease as you should, then the left part of the graph flattens to where 7 is the minimized cost at minus 60%. If you decide to develop your provinces, the sheer cost of doing so means you have to be careful of the implications beyond your borders. It sort of becomes like a prisoner's dilemma. While the region would be better off if you and your enemies both develop to get institutions, you can put yourself at a disadvantage if you're the only one to develop because you'll be dumping your points into getting an institution, which your enemies will quickly take from you from spread, but they'll have spent their points on technologies, coring new lands, annexing vassals, or further increasing their power, which can tip the scales in favor of them in the event of conflict. However, you're not entirely helpless when it comes to preventing institution spread to your enemies. In most cases, it's not worth it to try and stop it. Paradox has made it so institution spread is largely out of the hands of the players. If you border a lot of different countries, the costs do not justify themselves. But, in the right circumstances, there are some measures you can take to slow institution spread. One of the easiest ways to do this is if you're an island nation. Institutions spread across sea zones to other countries if and only if they have positive relations with you, as I stated earlier. Simply insult them, set them as rivals, claim their land, or do anything else so relations go below 0, and you can completely stop institution spread this way. Another scenario is if you have a small land border with someone. You can slow the spread to their provinces by getting relations negative as before, and you can slow the spread to your own border provinces by making the spread modifier as low as possible. Institutions spread quickly to all your provinces when you embrace them, but you can slow this through things like scorching the earth, declaring war on faraway countries, lowering stability to 0, removing the border provinces from states, etc. Here you can see an example to show the difference it can make. In this Castile game, I embraced colonialism in 1500, saved the game, and let things proceed normally. France gets colonialism in one of its provinces in just 4 years. I then reloaded the game, and this time I made an effort to slow the spread by setting France as a rival and lowering the spread modifier in my border provinces. France now gets colonialism in its first province in 17 years. By taking just a few extra precautions, I can keep an Iberian monopoly on colonialism for an extra 13 years, dramatically slowing its entrance to France, and by extension, the rest of Europe. Now I want to show you a few time lapses of institution development. To collect data, I ran a total of 4 observer games where I simply watched and took notes. The settings were as if this was an Iron Man game, with Lucky Nations set to historical. First, I want to look at each institution individually. To start off, here's how the Renaissance spreads. You can see that it's been embraced by most of Western Europe within 25 years of spawning, while it takes around 40 years to get to Eastern Europe. In the 1490s, you can see it start up in West Africa. In all the test games, Europeans were pretty quick to colonize West Africa, and as such, many of the tribal kingdoms like Mali and Songhai got all the institutions decades ahead of countries like China and Japan. Beyond this, the most interesting thing about the Renaissance is that in all 4 test games, somebody in East Asia got it through development. However, there were huge variations in how quickly this was done. In the second game, which I'll show you later, Korea developed it before 1500. In the 4th game you're seeing here, they didn't develop it until 1635, when it was practically on their doorstep. The most common places that developed it were Korea, the large Pacific Islands, and Southeast Asia, while places like Japan and India never even got close. The AI is also quite inefficient at developing it. In all games, nations would occasionally dump points into random provinces besides their main focus, leading to them getting the institution quite a bit later than if they had focused on a single province. They'd also sometimes leave the institution tantalizingly close without doing the final few developments. In this game, I think Korea was at 90+% to getting the Renaissance in their capital in 1600, but they just left it like that for over 3 decades. Next up, we have colonialism. In all the test games, this spawned in Iberia, either in Portugal or Castile. It's the most common institution to miss its target date by a few years, with the latest I saw it spawn being in 1515. After appearing, it travels along Spanish holdings in southern Italy eastwards, before slowly making its way up north. Due to how far west it starts, it's a bit slower than the Renaissance was, being developed by most of Western Europe 35 years after appearing, and then making it to Russia after about 70 years. Around 1565, you'll notice it starts getting developed in India. This is because there's a Portuguese event that's very easy for them to get that just gives them the province of Goa. Even though the Portuguese are usually on bad terms with the Indians, the fact that they get this province usually means India, especially the southern part of it, is more technologically advanced than places like China. Colonialism is also unique in that it's usually generated in a few East Asian countries through an event known as Introduction of New World Crops. You'll see that happen here in Borneo in 1615, as well as in Yan and Cochin in 1617. Next is the printing press. This tends to spawn in Germany, and because of its central location, it tends to be adopted by most of Western Europe within 20 years, then making it to Russia in another decade or 2. It's the hardest institution for non-Western powers to get because there are no events, and countries usually aren't in a good place to develop for it. The only way they can get it without natural spread is by getting Diplotech 15, and even then, its spawn rate from this is usually pretty slow. It gets adopted by all the important parts of the world about a century and a half after it spawns, which is quite a long time. Next is global trade, which stands in stark contrast to the printing press with how quickly it spreads. It's by far the easiest institution for almost all nations because it spawns relatively quickly from centers of trade, which are evenly divided throughout the map. It's basically everywhere within 3 to 4 decades of appearing. The final 2, manufactories and the Enlightenment, are quite similar to each other. They both spawn from buildings, making them the most asymmetric of the institutions. By that, I mean this is the only real time that some parts of Europe can consistently get institutions after parts of Asia and Africa, although it does still tend to spread faster in Europe. Nations that have been doing well in the game are the ones who have invested in buildings, meaning they start to do even better, whereas the middling states and the ones who are down on their luck have a harder time catching up. Nevertheless, both of them have been adopted by most of the important nations within 50 years of appearing. Now, while it's great to know how institutions spread, knowing that alone isn't super helpful. Rather, it's the average technology level, especially in military techs, that really matters. To gather data on this, I painstakingly paused the observer games every 25 years and looked at the average tech levels in each of the groups I designated. I then calculated each region's tech difference from Western Europe. I started data collection in 1500, with the results shown here. You can see there's not a huge difference between different parts of the map, except for the New World, Central Asia, and West Africa, which all start without feudalism. If we jump ahead to 1575, you can see a much bigger gap. This makes sense given where the institutions spawn, because Europeans get the Renaissance, colonialism, and the printing press much earlier than on the other parts of the world. You might also note the disparity for many areas military tech and admin tech, with military being far higher in many cases. This is a running theme for the rest of the world throughout all test games I saw. If we jump ahead to 1600 and 1625, we can see a bottoming out of the tech differences between the West and the rest. It's also at around this time that the Native Americans start dying out en masse, and it's interesting to highlight the differences between the two groups of them. The Totemists of North America have a much easier time reforming, so they average better tech levels compared to their Nahuatl and Inti neighbors, and this only becomes more exaggerated as time goes on for the natives that survive. Moving to 1650 and 1675 shows the start of the catch-up, as global trade is easy for everyone to get, and the first three institutions finally make their ways to the corners of the world in one way or another. The catch-up markedly accelerates at the turn of the 18th century. This is partially just a continuation of what came before, but is also partially because of how the game spaces technologies apart. You're meant to get techs every 13 years prior to 1700, and after that you're meant to get them every 15 years. This means the rest of the world has 2 years of extra time per tech to catch up. You can see that by 1750 and 1775, most parts of the world are technologically indistinguishable from Western Europe, especially on the military side. For an alternative visualization of the data, here it is presented chronologically by region, with the y-axis giving the year and the x-axis giving the amount of military techs the region is behind Western Europe. You can see that around 1600 is the optimal time to invade India and Southeast Asia, as there'll be about 3 military techs behind Europe at that point. So how does this all affect game balance? Well, Eastern Europe is definitely going to feel like it's a bit more costly to get technologies now. Areas like Russia, the Commonwealth, and even Scandinavia all suffer from tons of low development provinces, which can make their spread of institutions very slow. Russia in particular usually embraced colonialism 70 years after it appeared, meaning it got the full tech penalty from that institution. With that being said, in my games it didn't seem like the AI had much trouble keeping up in tech most of the time. That could be because lucky nations have slightly better monarchs, which means they have more points to throw around. Now, to contrast with that, for all places outside of Europe, this is a massive buff, to the point where I think this is the strongest the rest of the world has ever been. There are 5 main reasons. First is that the point cost can be better. Westernizing used to cost 3,600 points. If you're stacking development cost reduction like you should, this is about the same cost as developing 2 institutions. But if you prioritize the right expansion strategies, usually you can get away with only developing 1. Also, the AI loves development themselves, and you can take their provinces and steal their progress towards the institution, further decreasing your costs. Next, you don't have to wait for a border nation to westernize. For example, if you're in northern India and you want to become modernized from Goa, institution spread will happen automatically, making it much more reliable than hoping your neighbors will westernize as you had to do previously. Third, if you're developing, you can decide which types of monarch points you want to invest instead of doing equal amounts of all 3. Experienced players will easily see how this flexibility is powerful. Fourth, you no longer have the arbitrary restriction of 8 techs behind, which could actually be a problem lots of times for the player, and overall tech catch-up seems to happen much faster than before. But finally, the biggest perk is that non-Western nations never have to go through the Westernization decision. They don't have to paralyze their country for years or decades with horrible events. They don't have to dump thousands of monarch points into the void. If they want to develop the institution, they end up with a great province at the end, but even this isn't required. And this leads into the final point I want to make in this video, which is what I think about the system. Paradox took one of the most boring and deterministic aspects of the game and completely replaced it with something that adds many layers of interesting strategic depth, which allows for a much wider variety of outcomes. You've been watching footage from some of the games I ran, and even in this small sample you can see huge variation, with Korea developing the Renaissance before 1500 in the second game. This is exactly what EU4 should be about. It's that combination of things that are set in stone for guidance, along with things that you can change, that makes this a great sandbox. It's harder to stay up in tech in the 1500s if you're in Asia as it was historically, but it's certainly not impossible. The institution's mechanic has made that much more fluid and much more in line with the overall philosophy of the game. The fact that we got this in a free patch makes it all the better, and shows how committed Paradox is to making EU4 great. Because of all this, my overall opinion on the system is overwhelmingly positive. With that being said, however, there's room for improvements, of course. The first is that the spread seems a little bit off for the first 3 institutions. Eastern Europe seems to be getting them a bit too slowly because of their poorer provinces, while West Africa seems to be getting them a bit too quickly because of their proximity to European colonies on the Ivory Coast. Moreover, Portugal taking Goa through an event seems to be a bit too impactful. It can be the main way the first three institutions get to India and much of Asia, implying it's this great solitary beacon of light piercing into the darkness of Indian backwardness. In history, it was just a trading post, and while there is certainly an exchange of goods and ideas there, I don't think it went to the full extent of spreading institutions based on how they're designed in EU4. The printing press institution in the game clearly implies more than just the ability to acquire literal printing presses. Perhaps if it's a lone province, it should be somewhat less effective at spreading institutions. Some other minor changes I'd like would be other ways you could spend monarch points besides development that could create them in your provinces. This would give people who don't have common sense a legitimate option for getting them early, and would add more strategic depth to the game. I also don't think that the totemists should get all institutions on reforming. This isn't so much for balance because AI natives are never going to matter that much, rather it's to stop this oddity where one native borders one province of a western nation that's basically just a few log cabins at that point, but suddenly natives reform in a chain reaction that creates a tentacle of knowledge stretching deep into the continent where the Chickasaw tribe is as institutionally developed as northern Germany in 1574. My final main issue is the overall level of tech progression relative to Western Europe, especially in military techs. First, here are some screenshots for the tech levels in 1775 for my games. Here's Game 1, here's Game 2, and Game 3. As you can see, there's an ocean of green for most of the world, meaning everybody's around the same level. This happened in all my test games, even the ones I'm not showing you. Also, if you remember back to the tech differences chart and you look at the y-axis on, for example, India, you can see that the average Indian country was never more than 3 military techs behind, and even that was only for a short period, and it comes at a point when most Europeans aren't even thinking about Asia. When you combine a diminishing military advantage with the fact that Asians blob just as hard as Europeans, it leads to historical powers almost never getting involved on the continent. How often have you played games where European engagement in Asia stops at a few scattered islands in the Pacific? Moreover, have you ever seen the expansion of Bengali dye production event fire unless you personally annexed India? There's lots of flavor and opportunities for the game to more accurately model Western interests in Asia that's simply going unused at the moment. Now, to be sure, some of this is the fault of the AI not being good at intercontinental invasions, but it also doesn't make sense from a strategic perspective. Why would Great Britain try to expand in India in the mid-18th century as they did historically if the Indian powers were just as strong as France? It'd be better to avoid splitting your troops and paying extra distance costs for states and just attack someone in Europe instead, which I think is a bit of a shame. To be sure, Asia should absolutely get the chance to become as technologically developed as Europe. I just think it's a bit unfortunate that this is not only the default outcome, but from my testing appears to be almost unstoppable. So that's my opinion on institutions. A great feature with plenty of exciting possibilities for new strats, but it could also use some work. My thoughts were based on a relatively small sample of 4 games, so there's a chance you might experience something different. Feel free to leave a comment on your thoughts on institutions and how they stand at the moment. Also, if you want to take a look at the data I collected, I've put a link in the description. I'll also throw in a link to the code I whipped up to test the development cost for provinces, so if you know how to program in R, you can tinker around with it. Normally I wouldn't include any of that stuff because I know 99% of players aren't going to be interested in technical data like that, but if for some reason you want to take a look, be my guest. That's all for today. My name's Riemann, and until next time, thanks for watching.